Hello. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. My name's Maxine Beniba-Clark, and I will be hosting this wonderful conversation, as I'm sure it's going to be here today, with Peter Polites and Christos Tsiolkas. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the rightful owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I think as storytellers on this land, we're all kind of painstakingly aware of the stories that have been told on this land before us, and of the fact that we write now alongside what has for thousands of years been a really strong and powerful black writing canon. So we're really grateful to be able to live and write on this land.
Hear, hear.
So today we're going to be talking about two absolutely wonderful books. Christos's new book, Damascus, and Peter's book, The Pillars. I'll give them a brief introduction, although I feel like they need none. Christos Tsiolkas is the author of 6 novels, including Loaded, which was made into the feature film Head On, The Jesus Man and Dead Europe, which won the 2006 Age Fiction Prize, the 2006 Melbourne Best Writing Award, as well as being made into a feature film. His 4th novel, the international bestseller The Slap, won overall best book in the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. It also won many other prizes. The Slap and Barracuda were both adapted into celebrated television series, and his acclaimed collection of short stories, Merciless Gods, was published in 2014. His critical literary study on Patrick White came out in 2018. He's a playwright, essayist and screenwriter who lives in Melbourne. And for those of you who are familiar with Christos's other books, Damascus is unlike any other book of his I've ever read. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to him about that. Peter Polites. Yeah,
Hey. Thank you.
Peter Polites is a writer of Greek descent from Western Sydney. As part of the Sweatshop Writers Collective, Peter has written and performed pieces all over Australia. In fact, I think I first encountered him, at least reading his work live, here at the Wheeler Centre about 4 years ago, reading a piece from a trilogy of plays called Three Jerks with Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed and Luke Carman. Fell in love with his work when I heard him read. And it's wonderful to have him here. His first novel, Down the Hume, was shortlisted for a New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in 2017. And The Pillars is his second novel. Again, I think it's a big departure from his first work, Down the Hume. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with the two of you today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I think we're both excited to be in conversation with you, Maxine.
So I wanted to start, I guess, with talking about the seed or the genesis for these two books. I think for both of you, they are works that depart from your previous writing. Christos, I've heard you talk about your fascination with St. Paul, who is the main protagonist of Damascus from really your mid-teens. So I wondered if you would talk us through how the book came to be.
Yeah, well, look, the way I've described it is to say that I've been wrestling with this man, Paul, for a long part of my life, since I was a teenager. I mean, I'd heard of Paul as a young kid growing up in the Eastern, the Greek Orthodox faith, but he was just he was one of those grim icons in the church, and it wasn't really until we moved from, and so you're a Melbourne audience, so you can understand this. So we moved when I was 13 from Richmond to Box Hill North, and I started year 8 at a high school in the area, and it was it just felt really, guys, that I'd just been pulled out of a world and placed somewhere that felt so very, very different. And unlike Box Hill now, which has actually got quite migrant, it was really not that in the late 70s, early 80s. And it coincided with a time that I just knew that my sexuality was not straight. I didn't have a word for what it was, but that was... And I joined an evangelical Christian group.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I was making or trying to make a bargain with God. If you make me not gay, I will be good. I will. And the Paul I encountered was the Paul of Corinthians 1, and all I could hear of that voice in the New Testament was that you are exiled from the kingdom. It's that an injunction along a long list of people who are forbidden that God's love, that Israel for love, has made very famous the last couple of years. And then I just want to be quick about this. This is the genesis. And then in my 20s, late 20s, in a period of another kind of confusion and despair, I had got really angry after I left the church, which happened at 15, like really angry. So I stopped believing in God, but I actually still had a rage against God, and I think probably a lot of you might have gone through a similar experience. And then at this point of weakness, I actually walked into a church and fell into prayer and sobbed and read Paul again in that space. And it was just out here in a uniting church in the city, not far from where I was working. And instead of reading harshness, I read solace. So that's a long way of saying that I have encountered Paul through various points of my life, and this book is an attempt for me to try and understand my relationship to an ethics that has formed me and that I've been struggling and wrestling with all my life, all my adult life.
Before we go to Peter, I might just ask you another question. Why? I mean, I know that this is something that kind of has been in the background in your life that you've been thinking about, as you said, since your teens. Why now? So the book took 5 years to write. Was there something that precipitated you thinking this is the time?
You know, and it's so, you know, the book has only very recently come out, and Peter and I were part of a fantastic conversation we had in Sydney just a few weeks ago. And it's like you know this as writers, right? You sometimes you're working from an instinct. You do all that intellectual work, and you know, of why do I want to write this book? How do I want to write this book? But sometimes it just feels like instinct, and I don't. And then in the conversation, someone asked about grief, and I think
that was me.
Yeah, yes.
Peter's done my work for me. Thanks, Peter.
and look, I really, it makes sense now, Peter. Like after having that conversation, that I lost my father 8 years ago, right? And which is, you know, I started this book not very long after, maybe a year and a half. I actually started the thinking work of this is the book I'm going to write. And I think the loss of a parent is always hard. Of course, grief is always hard. It's that sense of what I owed my dad and my mother as a migrant son too comes to the fore, and also a sense that I was changing, and that I felt a little confused. More than a little confused. I felt that I was suddenly I wasn't necessarily felt part of my tribe anymore. I was asking different kind of questions, and that's the Paul I also wanted to write as someone who changes their life, someone who is an observant Jew in this community who decides to abandon it all. That's a harsh decision, and that's the character. That there's something I think in the experience of grief that made me turn again to Paul in a way that I hadn't before. I think the other thing too, just really quickly on that, is I realised how important Orthodox ritual was for me in the process of grief, and that it feels like we don't often talk about it in a secular culture. And I'm not a believer, but that there was something that I found in the ritual that was really important, and I think that too, in effect, kind of influenced the book I wanted to write.
And we'll come back to that idea of kind of transformation in character later. But Peter, I wanted to talk to you about, I guess, in the same way the genesis of the pillars. In terms of Down the Hume, that book for me encapsulated a part of Sydney, particularly Western Sydney, that we don't often see in Australian literature. And the pillars adds a whole nother component to that, you know, this idea of this suburb or this kind of artificially constructed area called Pemulwuy, named after an Aboriginal warrior that is one of those kind of like kit home type areas. You know, everything is fake designer, everything is identical. Where did the seed for writing about or placing your characters in that kind of constructed world come from?
It's I think a novel has a multiple genesis. And I think for me, the initial genesis for this novel, The Pillars, was when I was driving my mother, she's quite immobile. She hasn't taken care of herself, and I was driving at a physio, and I think she did all this physio stuff, and I think it unlocked part of her emotions. And then she pointed to this house, and it was one of those old log houses that had like the lemon tree, the olive in the yard, the columns, you know, and you could see that Greeks had lived there, and to me that's kind of beautiful. But she started crying, right? And I didn't want to ask her what's wrong, but she said that, oh, I remember that when we just moved to Belmore, a woman was murdered by her husband in that house, you know? And what it meant for me, because I always considered myself as part of a community of Belmore Greeks, and we're kind of this like working class, proud Greek, strong community. There's a church up the road. We know where every single Greek house is in the street. And I realised that house that been driving past my whole life was a symbol to the women in the community, to stay in order, to stay in line. And so from that moment of fear that I think the women in my community experience, it expanded out to houses, fear, security, and then we get into the whole suburbia, the aspirational nature of suburbia and what it's masking. So that's where it really,
Yeah, it's interesting that was the starting point. I think in both of your books, even though they're really male heavy, you know, there are a lot of male characters in the book, the women that are in the books are these extraordinarily strong centres of their community in different ways. They're kind of persecuted by the men in their lives, they're persecuted by the state, they're persecuted by patriarchy, but there's something in them that is just so kind of powerful and so kind of stoic, I suppose. And I wanted to talk about that, this idea of, you know, I was watching an interview with, can't remember who it was, but it was a Hollywood actress who said there were no strong roles for women out there. And it seems to me that kind of, in particular, multicultural ethnic literature, that's where the roles for strong women are. And so I might talk to you, Peter, a little bit more about the creation of that mother character. So the protagonist in your book, Panos, is a poet, and he is living in this suburb, which is kind of this slick new kit home area, but also has ties to, I guess, the old suburbia through his mother. So taking that kernel of an idea of kind of driving with your mother and looking outside this house, what was the next step in kind of, I guess, creating that character of that mother, thinking about what that house stood for that community and how you could encapsulate that in her character?
First of all, the thing about that strong female thing, I don't like that term strong female character, because those are just the women in my community. And I think the precedent for those women in my community can be found in literature. So before we were talking about someone like Medea, someone like Artemis, someone like Athena, who whenever she had the shits, she would do something troublesome to whoever Zeus had an affair with, you know.
That's true.
And so And so I grew up being told those stories by my mother, reading them in children's book forms. So it's not uncommon for me to see women as the agents of the change and of the inciting incident.
But it's, I think, to me anyway, it is often uncommon in Australian literature, I suppose. And that perhaps is a comment on, I guess, the lack of diverse stories in Australian literature.
I mean, they're tough character. Like, migrant women are tough. They have to be kind of to make that, to do that journey. I mean, it's hard enough for any migrant or refugee to do that story. But, you know, as a woman, you know, so you look at our mothers, right? They've made a journey to a place where often they're not speaking the language. I mean, they're young. They're not coming from a university-educated bourgeois world at all. And they're starting, like, there's a hardness that has to come from that experience itself. And I think, you know, there's that ancient, you talked about Medea, but there's also in, you know, growing up, you know, there's a thing that can happen in the Greek household where the boy is fated, you know, he is celebrated, you know, and it's in Damascus, even though it's set 2,000 years ago, there's a refrain, let me have a son, let me have a son, the women don't matter. But it was my experience, and I think it's not a surprise that Peter and I are both queer in that for me at least, it was actually the girls and the women in growing up who were the risk takers. They were my inspiration, because what happened with the boys is that they were looked after. They were, you know, number one Greek son. Whereas, you know, I was talking to you about my cousins who were a little bit older than me, and then they were inspirational, because when they had to make the decision to something as simple as, I will know this is the boy I want to date, they would be met with a ferocity back then of the social system. And I think as a young queer boy, I remember having long conversations with my mum, with my aunt, with those older Greek women, and there was something that, it was almost like I was, and I'm really grateful for this, that they were arming me with knowledge about how tough the world is, and that you're going to have to have that armour as a young queer kid going out in the world. And just as you were speaking, Peter, I had a really, you know, one of those memories. I'm a little kid, and Zorba the Greek is on television, the Michael Kokoyannis film based on the Kazantzakis novel, and there's an amazing scene where Irene Pappas, who I think is a goddess, is stoned in Crete because she chooses to make decisions as a woman that is not acceptable in a patriarchal culture. And I just remember Mum and I both howling in that scene. And just really, the other, Christos Tsiolkas, who was one of the great modern Greek writers as well, he's got I don't know if you know it, called The Third Wedding Ring, or Wreath, you would translate it, which is, he wrote in the mid-20th century, and it's all about how tough Greek women are and how bloody soft the men are, and how they and he was an amazing figure. He actually lived in Australia for a while before they kicked him out, because he was a trans prostitute, and he was working in the Cross, and then clearly the Menzies government didn't think that was an acceptable kind of migrant to have on our streets in the 60s.
But even in our histories, so because for 700, Greece was formed under occupation for 700 years, and one of our most important freedom fighters was a woman called Bouboulina, and she was a commander of a Greek fleet that took on the Ottoman Empire, and so we have the history of warring women in our own history in the modern state of Greece. But in my book, what I tried to do was create two narratives, right? So I tried to create the gay male linear narrative, and then the story of the mothers. And the story of the mother, whenever I read about the mother, I try to do this non-linear thing. So it goes back and forth. It's still within the time frame of the novel, but it switches back in time. And I think that's a nod to the ancestral villages that our parents came out of, because they literally came from these pre-electricity, pre-running water villages, and their existences were cyclical. So it was more important what the moon looked like than that was the most important thing, because that's when you'd know when to sow, when to wash, when to sow seeds, when to harvest, and that's why I tried to create a non-linear experience of the ancestral village.
I think for me what came through in that kind of structural sense was the lightness and dark in the pillars that interspersed between this very artificial contemporary world. You have this story of a mother and her child and their community. And for me, it was kind of, I don't know if you intended it that way, but those chapters were a relief. It was kind of like, even though there was a lot of sorrow in them, it was like after the world of the pillars, this kind of completely artificial capitalist world, there was this kind of genuineness there. How much consideration goes into the structure? Do you think when you're writing about, is your responsibility to the art, or do you think about the reader's experience and kind of how you space those stories out?
Can you answer that? I'm not experienced enough to answer.
Look, for me, Maxine, I think there's particularly about fiction, I think non-fictions are different for me. Anyway, I kind of approach non-fiction differently, but with fiction, I don't think about the reader at the beginning at all. Structure, and I found this accidentally with the first novel I wrote, Loaded, because it was you don't know what writing. I mean, you love books, and you want to write, and you hear this voice, and I heard this voice of a young man who I called Ari, and I started writing, but I didn't know how to write a novel, and it was just one of those happy accidents that I told myself, what if I set this story over 24 hours? So you've got a beginning and you've got an end. And it was truly, it wasn't like I'd read it in a book, or I fell across it just trying to work out how I was going to tell this story that was dangerously meandering into different areas. And so structure, I think, for me, is how I begin a novel with two things. One is the voice. If I hear a voice of a character, and with Damascus, actually the first voice that I really heard was Vrasas, who's the owner, right? So who is an ex-soldier, a pagan character. So that was in a way the first chapter. That's where I really began, in a sense. But to responsibility, maybe in the third, fourth, fifth draft, you begin to ask questions about, does this make sense? Is this, and I'm very, very lucky with the editor I have, who's Jane Paul-Freeman from, we've been together and we're really close friends for over 20 years now. So, and my partner Wayne's a great reader. So he'll ask that sort of questions, but there is a selfishness in fiction. And sorry, Peter, because you've heard me bang on about this only recently. I've just started this year rereading Jean Genet, the great French writer. Yeah. And
Our Lady of Flowers?
A Lady of the Flowers, Miracle of the Rose. I just finished Querelle. I'm just about to start The Thief's Journal. Thief's Journal in particular was so important to me when I was an adolescent. Like, I loved that book. So, but there is a great line in Miracle of the Rose where he says, a novel is not a humanitarian report. It's and it stayed with me, because it's like when we do fiction, we're doing something else. Maybe when I'm writing an essay about a political situation, there's a different kind of responsibility I feel as a writer to the reader. But with fiction, I feel like I want a tattoo of that line. A novel is not a humanitarian report. We do something else.
I guess on that subject, Peter, this idea of fiction as, I guess we see with non-fiction, particularly with political reportage, freedom's constantly being curtailed. You know, we've had things like the ABC raids and things like that. Is fiction the last bastion of freedom? Do fiction writers, or do you feel as a fiction writer, I guess, in the literary arts, I guess, that we have a responsibility to go places where other writers maybe can't go?
Oh, that's such a hard question, because I've been thinking about. I asked you on Friday.
I know. Now I'm turning it back on.
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
I couldn't answer it, so it's payback time.
My current working theory about fiction is I don't want to put it within the framework of human rights and all those things that kind of change all the time based on the era that we live in. But I do want to have a responsibility to a community of people that I'm writing for. So I think when I wrote The Pillars, I definitely wrote it for same-sex attracted men, queer men, but also I wrote it for my Greek community, the women in the Greek community and the men in the Greek community. So I try and think of my fiction as having a responsibility to a community of people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I mean, I think sometimes we make this, and I don't think it's a fair or a right separation between, you know, Christos the writer and Christos the man in the world. So the way you want to, the questions you're asking about ethics, and you know, Damascus is really at the heart of it, is a book about ethics, right? That's where I began with Paul, and with this thing called Christianity. But you want to think about how we are on this panel. You want to think about how you are with family. You want to think about how you are with neighbours. You want to think how, and this is distressing to talk about as Australian, how you are with the stranger, the refugee, which is also a really huge theme in the novel. And how, so it's not like that something happens when I sit down at the desk and write that suddenly I am no longer Christos thinking about those things. But in terms of your question about fiction, I do think that there is a risk that is worth defending in what you can do in imaginative work. That doesn't mean you don't make a mistake. You know that you may go into directions that are wrong, or you know, or. But I think we have to come from a position of good faith that it's all right to make mistakes, it's all right to fail, you know, that, and that it's all right for a member of the audience to come up to me and go, I really didn't like this representation, and for me to go, let's have a conversation about that. But it has to be that good faith that we can, you know, that that you've also got to allow me, and you've got to allow Peter, and you've got to allow Maxine the opportunity to take a risk. To do something astonishing with fiction or dangerous. I mean, you know, I was talking about Jean Genet, right, and how important he was to me as a young queer writer. There's danger in those kind of novels.
Literally, he wrote one in jail.
Yeah. So, you know, I think, so there is that space of the imagination that that it is about risk that I think is worth defending.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it picks up on Peter in the afterword to The Pillars. You talk about this obsession with nice characters. You know, this idea that in fiction or in literary fiction, you have to have a protagonist that people want to, or that they can root for, and you create. Some characters that are likeable, some characters that are completely despisable, all of them three-dimensional. Sometimes we have insight into why they are the way we are, and sometimes not. So I wondered if you wanted to, I guess, make comment on the construction of your characters and how you feel about that, you know, tendency, I guess, to want to find someone to love in a piece of literature.
I think you should just love the writer. You know, right? But the thing about that tendency to want likable characters, I think we've been influenced way too much by American cultural imperialism to likable people. And I think if you look at people's socialization, and I think we had this discussion about how someone's socialization influences the kind of person they're going to be more so than the actual being of a person, you'd realise that people have been exposed to a lot of horrible things, and that's why they are horrible. I think I remember one of the things that really grabbed me about Damascus so much was you create the social world so much, you create the environment, you create the political economy of the place, and that's what's influencing, you know, someone like Lydia, someone influencing like Paul. It's the morals and the politics of the time that affect the people more than their inherent being. And I think if you look at that, you can't say whether someone's likable or unlikable. You just have to observe what they're doing.
I mean, and then, you know, I think I remember with the Pillars, like there's moments where you know, just as a reader, I get really angry at Bunnell, right? At that kind of the choices he's doing, because he's a bit of a coward, you know. But I really understand too where that's coming from, and kind of what he's negotiating as the son of migrants, as a queer man trying to make sense of class and queer, which is, God, I love that as a topic. And who cares if he's likeable, is my feeling. And I just when you were talking, Peter, I remember years ago, I think it may have been after the slap, so I'm in Greece, and I'm with a friend of mine there, and I'm trying to explain people's, you know, because there was a lot of people saying with that book, there's no likeable characters, and I think you're absolutely right and correct to say it's an American influence, because I just remember this friend of mine, and she's a theatre actor, and she just went, I'll say it in Greek, "Dimma laki nafta, what bullshit is this," right? And she's going, is Medea likeable? Is Oedipus likeable? Like, you know, it's like she couldn't understand what likability, and I had trouble even trying to define that word, what likability had to do with literature. Yeah.
I think there were almost every character in Damascus, and most of them in the Pillars as well. There were points when the pendulum swung either way. You talk about that initiating character, Vrassos, who I think was maybe one of the only fictional, you know, characters in terms of not having a basis in scripture, being the first character that you wrote. I think when I first came to that character, I was, first of all, you started with a sentence that was 3 pages long. Thanks, Christos. But just thrown into the middle of a ritual sacrifice. Who is this person? You know, what on earth? Can I actually go with this story? And then over the course of that particular section of the book, you slowly start to understand the various decisions he's made, you know, people that he perhaps didn't understand at the beginning. He kind of comes to some kind of at least understanding of their humanity and the decisions that they make. Similarly with the character of Lydia, you know, we meet her as this witch who lives up on the mountain and accepts these babies as sacrifices, you know, these daughters and disabled children that are being rejected by the world, and then slowly get this backstory of how she came to be. Does a lot of work go into when you're constructing characters? I have shown people, and this is a question for both of you, I've shown the terror of this person or you know, the horror of what they can be. I now have a responsibility to, or I'm now going to unpack why that is. That idea that Peter talks about of socialisation, how much do you think about that in?
One of the things I'm kind of connected to the previous question for me with Damascus, also because it is set 2 millennia ago. That's a huge, you know, that the terms of, I actually needed the grounding that, Peter, you're talking about the social, like I couldn't pretend, you know, with previous novels, the research and the writing have been simultaneous, but, you know, I made a decision with Damascus that I wasn't going to write immediately because I needed to understand that world, you know, and I'm not a historian. So I studied really hard for 14 months before I picked up a pen to do it, so I could have some sense of this world. And what I discovered was some things of great beauty, including great beauty in the early Christian texts and in the Jewish texts of that period, and in the Roman and the Greek. But I also discovered a brutal world that was built on slavery. It was a slave society, and so that meant that I had to really think, what does this mean? What is this world that I've put these people in? And the other thing, and it goes to likability, I had to stop myself, and this took a few drafts, to stop sitting above the characters as a man from the 21st century and going that that I had to actually. So someone like Brassas, his code is not our code at all, and there are things he believes that are despicable, I guess is the word, in our consciousness, but I wanted to treat him faithfully and truthfully as a character, and say that there is actually, he believes in this code of honour, let me be faithful to it. And also trust, this is where the trust in the reader comes in, and I just assume this with every book I've ever done, that you're a smart reader. I mean that genuinely. I think to write fiction, don't, if you do think about the reader, just assume your reader is going to be someone like you. Someone like you.
I wish that was true.
Well, in the writing of it, what happens afterwards is...
Well, I read these sex scenes in my books, right? And so a lot of people get flustered when they read the sex scenes, because I try to write them as viscerally as possible, right? Because when I want people to have bodily responses to my book. I want people to laugh. I want people to blush. I want those experiences. But what I did was I peppered all the sex scenes with military metaphors, right? Because I wanted to, talk about these hyper-aggressive, sex between men sometimes is a competition and it's a war, and some reviewers or some people, when they read the sex scenes, they just blush. They don't try and read into the metaphors that I'm trying to create or the element. And I think maybe that's the difference between us. You have more faith for your fellow humans. But you also talked about that thing once where you genuinely believed that if you met someone who found your book sacrilegious and blasphemous, that you could sit down and have a heart-to-heart and convince them otherwise. And I don't believe that.
I don't know if I could convince them. I do think you're right, Peter, that I think there is a certain optimism of spirit, even when I'm feeling quite pessimistic. It's hard to be a sane person in the world at the moment and not fall prey to pessimism. But I do think I have that optimism that there is genuine possibility of conversation, right? And so one of the wonderful things that's happened over the last few weeks is a couple of interviews for Christian papers, and that they've been long and engaged, and when they approached me, I said, I am so happy to do this, have this conversation, but I want you to read the novel. You've got it, and then come back to me. So that's where my optimism, that I actually think people of good conscience are everywhere. And then there's the reality of the fist. There are some people who are not interested in that. They just want to... I can't answer that. I think there are people, there are some moments where you can't have that their people are so in their rage, in their prejudice, in their hatred, that all they show you is the fist. I just don't want to be that person.
Do bigots really read literary fiction, though?
Now that is a question, mate.
I want to talk a little bit, Peter, about the Australia in your book. I guess by that I mean what we're introduced to in terms of the, one of the plots is a collection of kind of main protagonists that come from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, and who aren't solely, it's not didactic, so they're not solely guided by what their religion dictates or what their culture dictates or what their upbringing, dictates. So we have, a situation where an Albanian mosque is about to be built in this particular town, and these various hodgepodge of residents in this kind of artificial village, town, as it would be, suburb, get together and contrive these plans to kind of get rid of this mosque, which turns into this kind of almost farcical, you kind of have them conceiving this idea of the gay Muslim who doesn't want the mosque built because then they might be persecuted by their own kind of thing. And this idea that, for me, it kind of, I guess, sent up those stereotypes of multicultural Australia, that you are just the Muslim or you are just, the queer kid on the block. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how and why you constructed that particular subplot and those characters.
I just want to... Pemulwuy is a real place. Mm-hmm. There are no mosques there. Mm-hmm. And there aren't Albanian mosques because Albanian mosques aren't really a thing. Mm-hmm. And I just saw my Albanian friend walk in before, so I have to do some clarification.
I mean, there's an Albanian mosque in Carlton.
Okay. We have more youth centres up in Sydney, And my Albanian friend is pretty famous in the Albanian communities, being the only accredited translator of both dialects. Hi. And what I wanted to satirise was the idea of there's this whole thing that we see in society at the moment, especially during the marriage equality debate, where it's like religion versus sexuality. And to me, those are completely artificial constructs, and they're used strategically and cynically, may I add, by people to divide the community. So what we're missing in the divide of religion versus sexuality is that there are religious people that share the sexuality of the minority, as you know, right? As we know in our lives. Like we know Orthodox queers, we know Muslim queers, and they can simultaneously have their religious values and simultaneously share their sexuality. Now in the book, what I'm trying to make a comment on is how in Australia we don't really know people's cultural heritage. Like, for example, I get racially profiled for whatever. I get spoken to in Arabic, I get spoken to in Greek, I get spoken to in Macedonian. Like, what the hell do I look like? What am I? On a much darker note, what happened to Nick Demopoulos in the way that he was racially profiled as someone from Middle Eastern background. What I'm trying to say is that the cultural and racial divide in Australia sometimes merges and overlaps. And cynical people try and use that to for their own benefit. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, what I was saying about that is that there's one thing that overrides all those identities, all those cultural divides, and that's people don't want their property values to go down.
Yeah. It's one of the pleasures of the Pillars for me was someone who's not from Sydney, right? So who's got a very limited knowledge. I love the geography of place, like how important place is in the novel. But in terms of what you're talking about, I've got to tell this story. I remember in the early 90s, I had friends who had moved up from Melbourne. They had started renting a place in Surrey Hills is it inner east?
That's inner east, yeah.
And so I was walking to the milk bar one day to get a pack of fags, and there was this old Greek woman sitting outside with her coffee, and I started a conversation in Greek.
How lovely.
It was.
Yeah.
And she said, she said, Apapuisi, where are you from? And, blah, blah, I'm from Melbourne. But she said, your Greek's very good. And I said, I really like it here. And she said, yeah, you should have been here in Surrey Hills and back in the good old days before all these bloody poofters moved in. He pushed in. And I went, okay, what do I do? And I went, Thea, Auntie, give me pushtis. And I'm a poofter. And she went, you know what she said? She went, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about those Anglo-rich ones. It's always been Greek poofters here. So in terms of what you're saying, Peter, that's the space. I mean, there's conflict in that racial, religious stuff, but there's also class, and that's
what I grew up in. Like Belmore, when I was growing up, was that. Do you know what I mean? To the point where I might see an old classmate's mother at the shops, and she'll inquire if I'm married or not. And initially, I thought it was homophobia, but no, she wants to set me up with her gay son. Do you know what I mean? So
there's this. I mean, there are many hilarious moments in The Pillars, but there's this thing that I guess encapsulates that struggle, which is the moment where the residents gather at Kane's house and look at this rainbow flag. Or one of the residents comes in and says, "Oh, what country is that from?" And there's kind of this silence, and then someone just kind of mentions some obscure, Eastern European, Scandinavia. And he said, "Oh, there must be very colourful people," kind of thing. It's a very funny book. I urge you all to grab it. We're going to throw to questions now. So thank you to Peter and Christos for indulging me.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you to Maxine.
So we have a microphone on either side. If you have a question, stick your hand up and the microphone will make its way to you. And please don't be shy. We've got a good 15 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you. I'm interested, Christos, in your thoughts about gay class structure, and can you elaborate on that and how you see that?
Okay, I will say that feels like a conversation that you would love to have over a drink or a coffee, kind of, because it's a big one. I mean, for me, that they are the fundamental kind of ways of my having moved through and moving through the world and continuing to do so is trying to understand sexuality and class, and the relationship between them and the changes that are. I think one thing personally that I'm fascinated by is the notion of passing. So what you can do as a young queer person is you can pass as non-queer if you wanted to. That you can. And there's a point in my life where I knew that could have possibly been a choice. And I think, sorry? Yeah, for survival, of course. I mean, that's why you would do it. And then there is, and that I'm interested too that can sometimes be the experience of class. That class is, a really basic way of saying that is the big change for me was the move from my world into the university world, where suddenly you come into contact with a world that, man, it could have just been a few blocks down from where you grew up, across the river from Richmond to Hawthorne, but you don't. You've been living in the world and you don't know that it really exists. And class for me was like it went bang. So this is what class is. So what does it mean? And what does it mean now that I've got an education? Do I become another class? And I always ask myself, now what class am I? Now I'm an educated bourgeois man, but knowing where I come from, and that's then further complicated by being a migrant son. So as a migrant child, to this day, when I go and see my mother, which I did yesterday, I'm speaking in Greek. And my Greek's not good enough to have this kind of conversation. So we're talking. It's almost like I'm going back to a world, but she's also coming. That interaction between what class is, what sexuality is, and I'll put all my aspects of identity. The battle I have in life. I think class affects the kind of sexuality you have, in my experience. I think class is, that you have an understanding of self as a person of a working class background that doesn't mean you can't have the most wonderful relationships and contact with people, but it will inflect the relationship you have in the world and in the world of sexuality. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think it is, for me, fundamental class. And it has affected everything I've written, everything I've experienced, everything I think about. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I want to ask you about Lydia because I just cried all through that chapter, and it's quite a long chapter. And you're all identifying who you are. I'm 75. I'm from an Irish Catholic Australian background. Enough's been written about all of that, but I used to have to fight the state school boys going the other way to the convent. I could box, but because I grew up with boys in the street. I'm also a rural person, but I think with it coming back to Lydia, I just identified with her because being a young woman, being a Catholic, and being shamed, I went through the adoption epidemic. We're still not allowed to talk about it. So there are many women my age carrying this. And I found Lydia, I mean, I actually had to be remembered. She was the first woman saint, or was she?
She's in the canonical Christian Bible, so in the Book of Acts, and for people who are not from the faith tradition or atheist, the Book of Acts is half of it really is the story of Paul, and in Acts we're told that the first Greek person that Paul brings into this new faith
Is Lydia. So what is she for you personally? You're talking about women, you're talking about your mother, talking about being women in a Greek community. What is she for you? Because, you know, I just found her superb.
Oh, thank you. I think for me, Lydia is, you know, the suffering that she goes through is the way. It was only by writing the Lydia chapter. I said that I started with Vrassus, but really that I knew that I had a book is when I wrote Lydia. And I wrote it. I'd actually started writing the voice of her slave, Goodness, and that just wasn't working. And that's another conversation. And then I just didn't tear it up. It was I just put away everything I had done, and I just had this inspiration, like just this. Sometimes there's just like a gift that comes, and you don't know where it comes from. And I thought, I'm going to write in Lydia's voice. I'd already.
How long did it take you to do Lydia's voice?
That first draft of Lydia's was like 2.5 weeks. Like it was rough, but it's just as soon as I found her voice, I knew that I had the novel. And for me, Lydia is important because she was my way into going, what was it that someone like her who has suffered so much? Because she's, for people who don't know the novel, her first child is a girl. It's abandoned. She's also not, you know, talking about likability. She has slaves. She's actually cruel to her slaves as well. But she actually suffers, and it's only in the words of a prophet called Jesus that she hears interpreted from this man called Paul that she finds a way of solace in the world. And so what is she for me? A hope, like a hope. And that's the chapter, right? A hope in Christianity that all the institutional churches feel like they've abandoned. In that the suffering of the child, the suffering of the slave, the suffering of the homeless person, the suffering of the refugee, that's where Jesus resides. You know, and I'm not speaking. You know, that's if you take your faith seriously and you're a Christian, that's where God resides, in that broken body. And it feels like the institutional church has forgotten that for thousands of years now. But Lydia is my link back to something that I think is inspirational in the beginning of the faith. Does that answer it for you?
My late husband used to go to the Victoria Market up Elizabeth Street, and it was just the start of all sorts of stuff happening in the churches, etc. And he used to say, "I see the face of Jesus in the people lying in the doorways." You know, it was
That's look,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry because but that for me is absolutely right. If you can't see that, no, I just think you've not really understood what is so powerful about that particular faith tradition. That the book and the final chapter of the book, there's a really ugly violation that happens to a child, and it's not that I was trying to answer, because I'm not Catholic and I don't come from that tradition, but it's like, I really mean that. If you cannot be Catholic, I think, at this day and age and not walk, and I think you can be Catholic and have your faith, because I have seen, I have friends who have got that faith and are Catholic and they're struggling so hard with what their church has done. But when you walk through the door into that church and you look up at that crucifix, the Jesus you see has to be the damaged child. It has to be the raped child. That is the understanding you need to have in relationship to that faith.
I think the I guess thing that really hit me about Damascus was it is a hard book to read, partly because of all that violence and all of that violation, but then conceptualising it in the context of today. You're right, what's going on in the church, what's going on in Manus Island, what's going on in Palestine, these atrocities. In your book, they're in biblical times, but they're actually literally unfolding as we're talking. And I feel like, it was a kind of the kind of jolt of realising that this is biblical times, but it's not biblical times. These things are still contemporary. So now I've got a question for Peter. No? There's one down here, the front.
So much a question. It's just a sort of a comment, I guess. I was quite fascinated, as an Anglo-Aussie, I was quite fascinated when you both referred very early in the talk to the continuity of ancient Greek deities in current life, given the overlay of Orthodox Christianity. Would you be able to just elaborate on that? I mean,
I think this is the problem with a lot of Anglo scholarship in terms of ancient Greece and contemporary Greece, is that there's a distinction drawn, and for me and Chris as Greeks, and for all the Greeks in Greece, and for all the diaspora Greeks, we don't draw the distinction between the Bronze Age Greeks and us. So the myths, like as a child, my bedtime stories was the Hercules and the 12 Labours. Those are my stories. Medea was something I grew into, the myths of Zeus, the deer being sacrificed by Artemis. Those are all our stories, and we don't draw the distinction between the ancient Greeks and the modern Greeks. There's no distinction.
That's quite fascinating. I gather with Roman Catholicism or the Roman Church, a lot of the pagan deities were incorporated as saints or resurrected as saints in the Roman form of Christianity. Does something similar happen within the Greek Orthodox Church?
We practice a lot of our pagan traditions in the guise of Greek Orthodox. So for at least, I think, maybe 4 months of the year, Greeks would go vegan. But that includes no sugar or oil, and that actually dates back to our pagan ancestry. A cleansing of the bodies that the ancient Greeks used to do as well, but now it's just incorporated in religion. Also, we do the red eggs things. That's one of the things. And there are thousands other traditions I can tell you about that are all pagan-based.
I grew up, like my dad removes the evil eye, for example, which is not,
that's a woman's job.
No. My yaya taught him, and he's taught my brother. So, that's not a Christian rite or ritual. So in terms of the other thing about your question is that Peter's absolutely right. I mean, the same thing. I grew up hearing the stories of the ancient gods, as bedtime stories. But I also heard, and this really influenced one of my books, heard vampire stories and ghost stories, and also the fact that our music that you grew up listening to is it also influenced by the Middle East, like in the Rimbetika. So you've kind of got, I mean, I'm really grateful that there's a heritage, that you've got all these elements that partly are Eastern Orthodoxy, partly are the whole history and culture of the Middle East, partly there's the Ottoman history, and then there's this ancient history as well, that they're a jumble, and that's how you grow up.
We have all these dumb Greeks around, right? And they'll say stuff like, back in the day, the ancient Greeks were traditionally blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And it's just such a myth. Yeah. Because, like, ancient Greece was as diverse as it is now.
Well, Greece, of course, all of the Aegean was always subject to migrations from elsewhere too. Anyway, thanks very much for that.
Well,
We have Hares and Hyena selling books at the back, both The Pillars and Damascus.
Thank you, Hares and Hyenas.
And we want to sell
Thank you,
out.
bookshop.
Okay? So I'm going to be at the door yelling at people if they don't buy books. Please thank Christos Tsiolkas and Peter Polides.
And Maxine!
Thank you. And when you see Maxine, make sure you ask her when her next book of fiction is coming out.
Yes, when is it?
She loves that question.
My most hated question. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.